Okay, so today's episode of Battle Fatigue, we want to give you a trigger warning right up front. We're going to be discussing some historical factors that led to the Roe decision or that interact with the Roe decision. And due to that, we need to have some really honest conversations that include conversations around sexual assault, abortion, bondage, breeding, even during the days of enslavement. And so because of what is happening in the country at this time, we want to be extremely mindful to the folks that may have an adverse experience with any of the things that we talk about. We just want you to be able to take even better care of yourself. And if this episode and the trigger warning feels like, I don't think I have the capacity for this, do what you need to do and take care of yourself. And maybe come back and check us out a different episode.
A to the J to the I see with the color layered hair you got going on.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening with my hair. It was dyed a certain color, and then 3
this
months
is not
later,
intentional.
here we are. No,
disclaimer: this is not on purpose.
No, this was not on purpose. So this like ombre rose gold blush strawberry thing I got going on was not planned. But here we are. Happy accidents. Like Bob.
Happy accidents. Happy little accidents. Call it the Bob Ross.
But that Bob Ross documentary was wild.
I haven't seen it.
His life was not full of happy trees.
You know what I'm at? Like, we never had a Bob Ross, Mr. Rogers crossover. That would have been great.
Yo, it should have been like Bob Ross teaching Mr. Rogers how to paint happy trees.
This is just the kindest,
most patient
most
episode ever.
Let's decide. Maybe there's a happy tree, evergreen tree. He lives right there. Start with touching the canvas. Use just the corner.
That would have been it. There's a Mr. Rogers documentary that's I can't remember what it's called. It's probably called "Won't You Be My Neighbor" or something like that. But it basically talked about how revolutionary the show was, and how kind he was, and how much he just wanted people to. He wanted a show that just was free in the way that like we ain't free until we all free type. Like, he just wanted a show that did that.
In a second, but let's stay on this little path of freedom for just a couple more minutes before we get into the not free.
Speaking of freedom,
right? Yeah. Before we get even further into this, also on this happy episode is Sultan, but remember you can't call him that. We hadn't finished doing intros. Like, we got to me and then we just started moving.
Yeah, no, we were moving through. It was fine. We're getting there.
And so in today's episode, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure how to feel about it. A large portion of folks in this country are understanding what it's like to be a Black and brown person in this country as far as how your rights are enacted. By the time folks will hear this episode, the Supreme Court decision to reverse Roe versus Wade will have settled kind of into the consciousness of people. And so Battle Fatigue took a little break because, one, we needed it. Two, this news is coming on the heels of the death of countless Black people. And three, there's a lot of information out there and we wanted things to settle a little bit before we give you the Battle Fatigue breakdown of kind of how we are processing the Roe decision. And so for the listeners who are going to be most impacted by this decision, interact with this episode however you see fit. But what we're going to do is talk about how this country has never really cared about the rights of Black women in particular, or Black folks who are able to have children. And so we'll look at that through a couple different examples. We're not really going to break down Roe in this episode because there's a lot of analysis out there. But we're going to take a look at the Black woman's body in terms of the way this country has used it and abused it through a couple different examples. Okay. I've been trying to figure out kind of where to start this conversation. There's obviously so many historical ways that we can look at this. We will at some point do an episode on eugenics, but we're not going to really get into any of these topics too much in depth. We just want to give you an opportunity to get familiar with these topics. And then in true Battle Fatigue form, go out and research these events and these folks that we're going to be talking about. So chronologically is probably going to be the easiest way for us to go. This is definitely a bring your notebook episode. There's going to be a lot of write this down, a lot of remember this for later as we move through this. But before we get there, Sultan, how are you doing? You should have seen the way he just rolled his eyes. Dang, my dude. I don't think I've ever seen you roll your eyes that aggressively at life.
It's really the news. It's news as usual, on top of like other news that is also usual, but has just provided so many large impacts and people that have responded to them in the way that they are. Like mental capacity, the storage, the emotional storage, the mental storage is filling up. But I've been able to take the breaks as needed, and also been able to digest things better than say, I don't know, a year ago or maybe even 2 years ago. I also know that there's part of that news, and in part of the reason why we're talking about what we're talking about today, I have a particular privilege in my experience and how exactly or how deeply I maybe am affected by some of the decisions that the Supreme Court has made. So I'm often thinking and reading and just trying to stay in a place of understanding and empathy and thought for women, especially Black women. And I know we're gonna get into it, but yeah, I'm doing okay. But it has been a lot, the last couple of weeks, of course, but also with recognition to the fact that it's been so much more right now for women. And so yeah, staying hydrated. You know what I mean? I got some water.
When in doubt, right, I'm just going to drink water with my business.
When in doubt, drink it out. Water. Water.
Please, just water.
Anyway, how about you? Quick check-in before we get into the meat of it all. How you doing?
Yeah, it sucks.
Yeah.
Boy, does it suck.
Yeah.
And what's curious about the amount of history I have in my head is I was like, oh yeah, no, I saw this coming. Now, this was going to happen. And the organizers and historians that I follow have been kind of preparing for something like this to happen. And it just adds the layer of like, damn, if we actually had just listened to Black women, like, I don't know, maybe we wouldn't be here. Or like the recent discovery that Rosa Parks had written a letter to the Supreme Court right before Clarence Thomas's appointment in like 91 and was like, look, I get it. And we're like really proud of Clarence as far as like him making it to where he got to, but also like he's not the dude. And literally in the second paragraph, she talks about how she's nervous about him possibly rolling back Roe.
Right.
And it's like, dang. So not only did we not listen to Rosa Parks, we didn't listen to Anita Hill.
Yeah.
And here we are, full circle, within our lifetime, which I think is the craziest part. It's like I remember reading about the fight for Roe in history books in high school. And here I am, 20 years out of high school, being like, oh, snap. How are you guys like, what is that chapter going to look like in the history books? It's like, oh, we fought for it. We got it. We didn't codify it into law. And then we lost it. And now all of a sudden Biden is like, I should do something about this with my executive powers. But it's frustrating. It is really disappointing that things had to get to this point for everyone to kind of be upset.
And that's what it is. Like you have to either directly affect white women or their pets. And that's what'll do it. That's what'll get them to move. That's what'll get the late night talk show hosts moving. That's what'll get, all these TikToks going. That's what'll get, the celebrities stepping out and canceling roles and doing what needs, like all that work that needs to be done. They just have to, sympathy only goes for so far. And it's just easy to be a couch quarterback in the movement. And that's what a lot of people tend to be, with the Twitter fingers. So it's complex, right? Because you're like, oh, you never listened and now you're listening. And then it's like, okay, maybe things then start to happen, but But it's like, but it didn't have to be like this.
It didn't have to be like this.
It didn't have to come here. And sometimes I feel like that they listen to Black women in the way to only determine what, like, to do the opposite. It's like, oh, what are the Black women agreeing with? Like, what are they wanting? Okay, so we're going to go in the opposite direction. Like, I think they're listening only to do the other thing.
I don't know. But part of this episode is going to hopefully help explain the kind of irritation and ire you are seeing from Black women in response to the way a subset of white women are responding very loudly to the Roe decision, right? This is not, we don't all lives matter any issues in battle fatigue. We are not saying all white women are doing this or majority of white women are doing this. Right. There's a subset of white women that are very, very loud that are asking why Black women seem to be gatekeeping, organizational tools or not joining the fight against this Supreme Court ruling. And that is a very unfair standpoint to come at these Black women from. And so I'm hoping that through some of the information that's given in this episode, there can be some understanding that Black women have been fighting this fight since the days of enslavement. And so you coming in and being like, oh, why aren't you, is really disrespectful, especially if you haven't done some historical research to understand why Black women are starting from the position that they're starting, if this is a topic that is new to you, right? Because if you're not a reproductive rights activist, or if you're not in the reproductive activist kind of circles, you may not know that, Black and brown women have been fighting for access to fair and safe reproductive options, I should say. And one of the things that's really curious is it's tied to eugenics, right? And we've brought up eugenics a couple times in a couple episodes, and we absolutely will do kind of like a origin story on eugenics just because of the racism that's tied to what we're dealing with right now. But we haven't gotten to that point yet. So I want to kind of start off a little chronologically in the days of enslavement, right? During the Transatlantic slave trade. Now, one of the things that we're not taught in school is there were two major periods of movement of human cargo. The first major one is the transatlantic slave trade, which is where enslaved Africans were brought straight from the continent and dispersed across the Americas and the Caribbean islands. The second one is the domestic slave trade, which happened after the U.S. government decided to make the transportation of enslaved Africans from Africa illegal, which is what happened around 1808 in America, right? After that, in order for you to be able to keep up the labor demands of the plantation, cotton crops, all of that, you needed workers. And so that started the domestic slave trade, in which breeding enslaved people became a major portion of how we got more bodies for hard labor. Yeah. And so some of the incentives for women to have children during the days of enslavement included things like exemption from hard punishment, extra clothing, extra food. Sometimes, which has happened very rarely, you were promised freedom. But this meant that you needed to have X number of kids by the time you were X age. And it depended on the plantation that you were enslaved on. So some people would say you needed to have 14 to 20 children by the time you turned 25. And if your children survived, right, because it wasn't that you needed to have those children and just give them a number, but those children needed to survive to a certain age, because obviously people didn't care about the enslaved children as long as they were able to produce. If they got sick, it's like, all right, bro, whatever. As long as you get better soon enough and you are back out there picking cotton, I really don't care. So your children needed to survive. Most of the time, you would have all these babies. You go back and be like, all right, I did what I needed to do. And they'd be like, yeah, all right, whatever. Go back out to work and whatever you were assigned. And so another way that they would do it is they would also force you to procreate with somebody on the farm. And this is where the kind of eugenics ties into. The early days of eugenics didn't really pop up in American kind of popular consciousness until towards the later part of the 1800s into the early 1900s. But the building blocks were always there, right? If you think about how enslaved people were looked at as being in a better position in the system of enslavement versus them being free, you kind of start to understand the early ideas of eugenics, which basically was a system to breed people that you thought were desirable and breed out the traits that you thought were undesirable.
Right.
And so the more modern ideas around eugenics included poverty. They literally thought that poverty was a genetic trait that you needed to breed out. What they called feeble-mindedness at that time, which was basically just, a lot of times it could be something as simple as you having ADD or ADHD, but it was an undesirable behavior, and so they needed to breed that out. And so sterilization practices would then be put on those folks that were deemed undesirable. But a lot of times during the days of enslavement, you needed a labor force. And so Black women were forced to have children. Sometimes if you could not have children and they didn't know if it was by choice or like your body just wasn't able to produce, you'd be sold off the plantation.
Yeah.
You'd be sold, or you would literally be beaten until you supposedly could try and have a child. They would bring in different men to try and impregnate you. It was a whole system. And so there were literally women who were tasked at having babies. And then they were also, their bodies were used to feed the children of the white women that they had to take care of their offspring. So you were turned into a wet nurse. Nothing about your body was your own, including the milk that your body produced. And part of the reason you needed to have children is so that you were able to produce breast milk, and not even necessarily for your own children, but for the children of the person who owned you.
You said that they would beat these women until they could do, that reminds me of, parents that like beat their kids and like, stop crying before I give you something to cry about. Mm-hmm. And it's like, so how's that work? Like,
so there were some enslavers who basically felt as though the folks held in bondage were purposely either taking herbs, roots, or whatever, or purposely giving themselves miscarriages or purposely giving themselves abortion as to not have children. Because you kind of understand that if you have children at any given point, your children could be sold from you. And so one of the ways of active resistance or passive resistance that enslaved women would enact is they would give up their babies while their children were still fetuses. Or sometimes there's even stories of mothers actually killing their children when their children were, under 10 or something, because they could not fathom their children going into
10.
Yes, having their children go into bondage or being sold away from them. You got to understand, you had less rights than a dog, right? There were people who cared more about their animal and their livestock than they cared about you as a human being. There were laws enacted to prevent you from even being able to defend yourself against a white person attacking you. Like you even putting your arm up to block a hit that is just a natural response that your body would do would be considered an act of aggression against the white person, right?
Huh.
There have been people put to death for fending off sexual attacks. A girl as young as 15, this man used to come and assault her every single night for years. And finally, one day she had enough. And she hit him over the head with a piece of wood, a piece of firewood, and he died. And she went to court. Of course, she was arrested, Black enslaved girl. And the court said that she had no legal standing to ward off the sexual advances of the man who owned her because she was a piece of property under the Fifth Amendment.
I'm thinking about women who, first off, slavery was more than just picking cotton, getting raped, and getting whipped. Like there's so much that we don't know about slavery, about what Black people went through, what white people put them through, to the point, because just imagining like, oh, slavery was so bad that mothers were killing their children that they'd carried, had been living with, caring for, feeding, protecting for 9 years, establishing that relationship, and then knowing that in spite of that, knowing that going through the utter and complete devastating heartbreak of killing their child, like deciding to bear that be better than what their child would end up going through, potentially because they had a daughter or had a son, like whatever it might have been, the path that they would end up being sent down. Like that is you do not come to a decision like that lightly.
No, you don't.
Like and I can only imagine that she was like, how many times that she may have decided, like, I'm going to do it. And then doesn't.
The kid looks at you.
And doesn't. And
giggles
and finally,
or something. And you're like, just like, nope, can't do it.
That is how.
Can't do it.
Slavery was bad.
And you trying to rename it involuntary relocation is not going to shift how bad it is. And it actually says more about how, like, little you care about those people who survived slavery and their descendants by you not even wanting to name it as what it is, right? And the thing that also is like so insidious about that time period is, let's say by chance you happen to be a young 15-year-old kid and you got a crush on some boy at a different plantation, right? Who happens to also be around 15, 16. Now, the both of you have, reached puberty, and the master from the other plantation notices that these two kids from adjoining plantations have a crush on each other. Most likely what would happen is those two masters would get into cahoots and they would try to force a union between these two people who just so happen to have a crush on each other, right? The over-sexualization of young Black children. It happens all the goddamn time.
Right.
So now, all of a sudden, you are found yourself and you're like, holy shit, I'm married now at 15. And they're like, cool, so y'all get going. Now it's time for y'all to have babies, right? Because they know that you are of childbearing age. Right? You've reached the maturity level that your body is able to have children. Okay, cool. So you guys get together. Let's say you guys have the semblance of a happy marriage, as happy as you can be held in bondage. It's been, let's say, 2 years. Y'all still haven't had any children. You don't know if it's because he's shooting blanks or because her eggs aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Right?
Which can happen.
But at the end of the day, the two of you are in a happy marriage, right?
Yeah.
I got my man, I got my lady, we good. The two masters are like, nope. They will break up your family.
Yeah.
Now you, the lady, you now got to go marry some other dude. And the dude got to go marry another lady because they're like, the only point that you guys even had this union is because I needed you to produce children.
Yeah.
Because now we don't have a way to go and get an unlimited source of labor from this other continent. We have to make the labor force ourselves. And so even the simple fact that you're like, yo, in this crazy environment, I was able to find love. I was able to find family. And it's like, that's taken away from you. So even if you were able to have a child, your child is taken away from you because your child is a way to make money.
Right.
Your child is capital and nothing else.
It's a business transaction.
It's a business transaction.
Right. Wow. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to get off.
No, you're good. You're good. So it's like when you have that as the origin of how Black women's bodies have been seen, you start to understand why we're looking at the Supreme Court like, y'all didn't care about us and our bodies anyway. And to make it abundantly clear, there's two major Supreme Court cases that folks should be familiar with when it comes to how the Supreme Court views both sterilization and just what you are able to do with your own body, right?
Right.
So again, we're not going to go into eugenics, but I still do want to give you at least the basic outline of how eugenics started. And most of us know who Charles Darwin is, right? He's basically called the grandfather of evolution. Charles Darwin went to the little island, saw the Galapagos turtles, and all of a sudden he's everybody's OG. Charles Darwin had a cousin named Sir Francis Galton, and he basically studied some of Plato's theories and thinking. And through one of those rabbit holes he went down, Plato basically was saying that the best of the best, like the best males, should breed with the best females so that you have a civilization of the best, right? That's basically what eugenics is. So Sir Francis basically took that and he ran with it and created the basis that Eastern Europeans were coming into America a lot of times through Ellis Island. And what was going to happen is they were going to breed, or they were going to have children with the supposed correct race, which is basically like your typical blonde hair, blue eyed Slavic type person is what they thought was the perfect race. And so they're saying these Eastern Europeans are going to breed with us and they're going to dilute our perfect blood. It's the same shit that Harry Potter was talking about with pure bloods and mud bloods and shit. Basically, this dude was Draco Malfoy and his family. And he was like, look, we are pure bloods. Ain't nobody diluted our shit. We're 100% us. And then Hermione comes in and she's like, F all that noise. It's mudblood or die, and you can get it whenever you want. And that's why she punched Draco Malfoy in the mouth in the third movie. That may not be exactly it, but basically that's it. And that's what eugenics was. And so the Supreme Court listened to a bunch of different cases, two of them being Ralph v. Weinberger and Buck versus Bell, right? So Buck versus Bell is probably the more famous one that most people tend to know about, and that was around 1927. There was a young girl named Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck's family, her mom and her grandmother, I believe, and a few other members of her family all ended up having developmental delays, right? And so they became what was called feeble-minded. And so because there was literally a hierarchical, a genetic way of pinpointing that, like, if this lady has a baby, that baby's going to be supposedly feeble-minded. That feeble-minded baby is going to have another feeble-minded baby. They used her as a perfect case for why sterilization, forced sterilization, shouldn't be protected by the Supreme Court, right? So the case goes, this dude, he's not important because he's an asshole, but the guy who basically tried the case against Carrie Buck had never met Carrie and her family and was like, look, if we don't do sterilizations, we're going to have a whole bunch of her running around and diluting all of the good that we've done so far since the days that we got to this country. And so the Supreme Court basically was like, under the Constitution, this is absolutely fair. You guys can keep forcibly sterilizing people. But that was mainly an attack on like white folks, right? And that's the thing that we need to understand when we're talking about reproductive justice, reproductive rights. A lot of the times, the way that abortions and the way that reproductive justice and reproductive rights were played out, it was played out before the days of enslavement to have black women have more babies because they needed the labor force. After the days of enslavement, you needed black people to have less babies because now black people were starting to be, a population that was getting a little big, that white folks were like, hold up now, like, this is supposed to be a white man's land. And so that replacement theory that you tend to hear people talk about, white supremacists, the whole you will not replace us theory, the reason why that lady at the Trump rally was like, you did this for white lives, is because there's this assumption, and we know through census data that at some point white folks are going to be the minority in this country, even though they would still hold power as though they are the majority. And so what you're seeing a lot of times in these conversations between folks who are anti-abortion and folks who are pro-choice is this fear that all of a sudden white people are going to be the minority, right? And there was this kind of interesting joke, but also a non-joke going around on social media after the NBA draft a couple of weeks ago, where it was literally like a white mom, a mixed son, and a black bald-headed dad, right? And almost all of them damn kids' names were Jalen. I don't really understand why everybody's obsessed with the name Jalen. I mean, I like it. I actually have a nephew named Jalen, so, it is what it is. And he plays basketball. But that right there is the fear, right? That we're going to have a bunch of light-skinned, racially ambiguous kids running around, and you're not going to actually be able to tell, like, who is a white person, who is a black person. And it's a lot of, like...
Good.
Be like, excuse me, what does your great-great-granddaddy look like? I just want to see something. So basically, the thing that's most concerning about the Buck v. Bell ruling is that the ruling was never struck down by the Supreme Court, right? That ruling is still on the books, that you technically can decide when it's appropriate to sterilize somebody based on eugenics type ideology. That's weird.
Very.
Also, like, there's a lot of things that's problematic with you not wanting to have a diversity in your gene pool. I don't know. Disease.
I don't even understand, like, what
malformations.
What it even matters. I mean, taking, black is beautiful and putting that kind of to the side for a quick moment and just being like, why white people were so like the adamancy, like of just so hard pressed to continue to put raisins in your potato salad. Like I don't do you just have to do like you could just maybe not put raisins. You put something else like some flavor. Like I don't know. It's just
paprika.
Throw some paprika on the top.
Smoke paprika if you want to get fancy.
Switch it up. Like don't. I think about. I mean, you know me. Like I'll sit here and consider thought processes and whatnot, leading to or what somebody might have been going through, and I don't think that it's even still a fraction of what it actually was, but it's weird. All that to say, you're right. It's
weird. Like, why are you so obsessed with somebody's doing with their own body? Right. And we've seen videos. Well, I don't know if you have, but if you haven't, I definitely think you should watch videos of what happens when somebody wants to go get an abortion. And there's all these people standing outside, literally screaming at you, yelling at you, telling you Jesus is not going to love you. Jesus is going to be mad at you because you're about to go murder your baby. And then they're like, well, we know we'll adopt your baby. It's like, no, you won't. How many babies have you adopted so far? Do you have a gaggle of children? Do you have a cloud shadow of ninjas at your house right now who are all from the foster care system? No, you don't. No. It's not that you actually care about babies, because if you did, school shootings wouldn't be a thing. Y'all don't care about them babies when they're out. You care about a fetus, okay? A fetus that looks like a weird seahorse that you can't even tell the difference between a human fetus and a dolphin fetus. Yeah. You don't actually care about the mother. And this is how I know y'all really just dislike Black women. So we know Fannie Lou Hamer is my #1 favorite person of all times, right? I know. It's a shocker.
Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Maybe we should do an episode or 3 about it.
The hateration of the dancery is strong today, okay? But Mrs. Hamer is known for using the term Mississippi appendectomy, right? Ooh. So Mrs. Hamer was the youngest of 20 children, okay? Because back in the day, you had mad kids, right? And Mrs. Hamer was the youngest of 20 children. So one day she went in literally for an appendectomy, right? Because her appendix was all messed up. While she was getting that procedure, they also give her a hysterectomy. And so Mississippi appendectomy is a term that is used to talk about the bait and switch that happens, right? You can go in for a simple procedure because you're hurting, right? You go in, and while the doctor is in there, they're like, well, cool, I might as well just cut out your fallopian tube, give you a quick little hysterectomy. And it happened countless times. In the 1910s and the 1920s, California passed the Asexualization Act, okay? And under that act, 20,000 people in California alone were sterilized.
Did and most they know? Of them, so that's what was happening? Okay.
I'm gonna get to it.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
But it's literally a bait and switch, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what happened to Mrs. Hamer. She went in for a typical routine procedure. They gave her a hysterectomy. With the Ralph sisters, it happened a little bit differently. And this is where like poverty and illiteracy is used as a way to also pull a bait and switch on people.
Did they do the appendectomy?
Yeah, but then they also...
Right. Okay.
Pull that out too, right? And so Mrs. Hamer was never able to have children, and that's why she adopted the children that she did have with Pap.
Yeah.
So in the Ralph sisters case, actually the New York Times Magazine did an article on the Ralph sisters a couple weeks ago, which is brilliant. I highly recommend folks check it out.
Yeah, we'll post the link.
We'll put the links to a bunch of these this information in this show in the show notes, so folks are able to have a starting point in research if they're more curious about it. But it's sisters, Mary Alice and Minnie Ralph. And they were from a poor community, super rural, and their parents couldn't read because they couldn't afford to get an education, right? And they were 14 and 12 at the time, respectfully. And so the government used to go out and basically try and get health programs to rural areas. We know they do shit like that even now, right? Like community health doctors and stuff like that. Basically, a representative went out to the Ralph home and was like talking to their mom and was like, hey, we're going to give your daughters birth control shots because the girls had developmental disabilities, right? And so they're like, we're going to give your girls birth control shots. And of course, all of that stuff is explained in a way that kind of makes sense, but doesn't really make sense. And you don't know what questions you're supposed to ask. You're just thinking, okay, my 2 daughters who have developmental issues, yeah, sure, give them birth control, because in your mind, you're thinking when they're ready to have children, they will be. But this birth control shot is going to help them because that's what birth control is supposed to do. But in actuality, they got sterilized. And so in 1974, the Southern Poverty Law Center filed a lawsuit on behalf of the Royal Sisters, revealing that between 100 and 150,000 poor people were being sterilized each year under federally funded programs across the country.
Across how long? What time period?
They're talking about the 70s, from the beginning of the sterilization project. And the problem
70s.
Is you don't know when they started doing those things because sometimes they get paperwork
this is
and sometimes
just when
they
it became,
This is just when it became knowledgeable to them. Because imagine, California was starting to sterilize people in the 1910s. North Carolina was doing its own thing. South Carolina was doing its own thing. Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, all under federally funded programs. But
and just
each
passing
state
notes.
Was doing, 100%. It's like, how'd you
so
guys
what
do it?
How are y'all doing it?
Exactly.
Like,
and so that's why Mississippi's are called the Mississippi Appendectomy. And even to take it a step further, in a name that most of us are familiar with, or at least I hope we're familiar with, Henrietta Lacks, right? 1951, Henrietta Lacks goes into the hospital. She's like, I'm having some vaginal bleeding. Can I get some help checking this out? And at the time, she goes to Johns Hopkins, which is like, Johns Hopkins. And also, Johns Hopkins is one of the few hospitals that was actually treating Black people. So let's be real about that, right?
Yeah.
There happens to be this guy there who's a renowned gynecologist. His name is Howard Jones. And while he's checking her out, he discovers that she has a malignant tumor in her cervix. And so he plucks the tumor out and he goes and he gets it tested, right? And at the time, he was doing a study on cells and how quickly they reproduce, they replicate. The cells that he was doing tests on would die after a couple hours, right? But for whatever reason, Mrs. Lack's cells would double every 20 to 24 hours. And he had never seen anything like that. And then all of a sudden now her cells are being used to study all sorts of things. And over the last, I don't even know how many, 50 plus years, Mrs. Lack's cells have been used for everything. And her cells were then called the HeLa cells because they needed to find a way to identify them, but also to hide the fact that they stole these cells from this Black woman.
So Henrietta Lacks, HeLa, yeah.
Yeah. So none of the biotech companies that have ever used her cells have ever given money back to the family. They've never asked for consent. The family is still to this day trying to get some sort of recognition. On top of that, her cells have been used to study the tests of radiation and poisons, to study the human genome, to learn about how viruses worked. Her cells were also part of the development of the polio and the COVID vaccines. They said that if you were to line her cells up, all the cells that they've taken, replicated, and duplicated, you could wrap it countless times around the earth. Countless times around the earth. And this family has never received anything from the scientific community at all. Nothing, not a single cent. They even put her medical records online for anybody to see.
Has there ever been like some type of response as to why there has not been that recognition or like sales royalty or something, No.
The family still, at one point they had put her entire genome online. Her entire genome. And the family was like, hold up. And then finally they were like, okay, we'll take it off. But no, the family is still trying to get some sort of recognition, some sort of something. And so when you are talking about Black women's bodies not being their own, literally down to your goddamn cells.
Down to the cells.
It is not your own. And then when we tie it to the gynecological aspect of it, so J. Mariam Sims is one of the worst humans in the entire world. Dead and alive, right?
Talk about it.
So he's credited as the father of modern gynecology. Or I should say he was credited as the father of modern gynecology because he developed
credited
tools. Exactly. He created tools that we actually still use today in gynecological practices. But the way he developed those tools is through experimentation on Black women's bodies.
Yeah.
Right? So basically what happened was Homeboy became the president of the American Medical Association in like 1876 or whatever. And he discovered or stumbled upon this issue that white women were having after childbirth. Like they were getting ripped up. If you don't know how childbirth works, I don't really know what to tell you, but like trigger warning or whatever. Basically, a human is growing inside your body, right? Where it's growing is called the uterus, and not all people have one, but the ones that do, basically the seed and the sperm get together in there and then they start cooking. As they cook, a human forms. Now, in order for that human to get out, it don't go out through your belly button, okay? It goes, Okay? There is a hole that is very, very small that needs to stretch to get very, very big for this human to pop out. And when this human pops out, sometimes you rip. Okay? I need you to I'm sure you can figure out what rips, but sometimes things rip.
Writing is sometimes.
I'm just saying, because apparently they're not giving sex education to kids in school.
So it was not the stork.
No, it was not the stork. And also, it does not come out your butt.
Not out the butt, not a stork.
Okay, you don't pee it out.
Not under your pillow.
No, it's not a Cabbage Patch. You don't wish upon a star or nothing.
The Great Pumpkin doesn't bring it along.
It's not a pumpkin patch either. You don't go pick it up when you go get your apple cider in the fall. Okay? So now that
sounds gross.
It is. And sometimes you poop afterwards too.
I think, man, when did I learn that? I think it was in my 30s.
Like a thing that, like,
I think I learned it in my 30s. I was like, y'all shitting? Why y'all? Okay.
Yo, when Steve had her first baby, I learned so much about childbirth.
Yeah,
I was like, you poop afterwards? Wait, I gotta pull out the placenta? Like,
it is a wild
slide
process.
Out with the baby?
What a wild process.
If men went through childbirth, I bet you this world.
Oh, there'd be so much. Yeah, there's of course. Of course.
No, you do whatever you want, sweetheart. It's your body, your choice.
Of course.
Okay. Anyway, so in order for J. Mariam Sims to figure out why this was happening to white women, of course, he needed an experiment in order to figure out what was the cause. And so a man on a plantation basically had a woman named Anarcha, and she was enslaved to him. Anarcha had just had a baby, and for whatever reason, Anarcha was still bleeding. And not only was it bleeding, was she bleeding, but she also was having other vaginal issues, right? And so the enslaver had heard of J. Mariam Sims and what he was trying to do, and so he had brought Anarcha to him to basically be like, yo, I need you to fix her. At the time, Anarcha was not the only person that was being held by J. Mariam Sims. A bunch of other plantation owners had heard of him and brought their people. All told, I believe J. Mariam Sims experimented on 15 black women during his 5 years or so that he was doing these experiments in Montgomery, Alabama. But the ones that we actually know their names are Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. Eventually, he even trained them to be his surgical assistants in order for them to take care of each other after he did experiments on them. And also to like hold them down, because he never did any of these experiments with anesthetic. He literally would poke and prod and stitch and cut them up. And you know where I'm talking about him cutting them up with no kind of anesthetic, because at the time, and it's still believed partially today, that black people have different pain receptors than white people. And thus we can handle more pain and need less pain meds.
So, I mean, we talked about that before, but it's like all the same. He taught them to be their own, like, to be each other's Band-Aids.
To be each other's Band-Aids and nurses. And so through those experiments, we got a lot of the gynecological practices that we literally, and tools that we still use today. And yet in all the conversation about him being the father of modern gynecology and all the things that he did to get, childbirth to be less daunting and less crazy and less painful for these white women, there's no conversation about Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and the other women who had to go through what they went through in order for these advances to be what they are. And so when you're really thinking about how disrespectful it is for this subset, very loud group of white women to be like, you guys are supposed to be with us. It's all women. Like, oh my gosh, this is happening to all of us. It's like, girl, where have you been for the last 300 plus years? Because this has been happening. Black and brown women have been desperately trying to have control and autonomy over their own bodies for centuries. Not that it's happening to you. All of a sudden now we all need to band together. Where were you guys at when black women were being sterilized? Where were y'all at when black women were being told that we couldn't have children, or we were told that we were unfit mothers, but yet not talk about the system that put us in a place that we could not mother in the way that we want to mother?
Right.
So as you are jotting down this information, as you are looking into whatever action you may be able to do that hopefully is sustainable, because this is going to be a long fight. First of all, them justices is not dying anytime soon, okay? And if they do, I don't think we're going to get a progressive justice into the Supreme Court for a while, which means we are going to be dealing with conservatism running this country for a good period of time. Also, if you don't vote, you can't complain. I'm sorry. I understand that not everybody is down for voting, but you need to vote. Voting is going to be the very bare minimum you can do to try and protect yourself and your family, your crew, your community. Especially if you live in the state of Washington, we have it really easy compared to other states. The mess is mailed to your house. Go check out a voter guide. I'm not finna tell you how to vote, because that's your business. You vote for the world you want to live in and the world that you want your kids to live in. And if you want to vote for people to have less rights, I'll be sitting outside of heaven's gates watching you trying to get in and failing. But again, that's between you and the God you pray to. Ain't none of my business. But hopefully this kind of gives some historical context as to why Black women are looking at that very loud subset of women with a whole lot of, I know you ain't talking. And it's mad disrespectful. So some of the things I encourage you to do is look up organizations that are run by Black and brown people within your communities. Do not try to start new organization. There's mad organizations that have been doing this fight for decades, and go and support them. I highly encourage you to start looking up the lack of intersectionality in feminism as to reproductive justice and reproductive rights. The lack of intersectionality is part of the reason why we are in the issue that we are in right now. And I also encourage you to look up some of the names that we mentioned today. Please look up Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. There's a brilliant monument to them in Montgomery, Alabama that's run by a lady named Michelle Browder. Highly recommend y'all checking that out. Please look up Henrietta Lacks. There was a book written by her. I think Oprah was in a movie about Henrietta Lacks. I think she played her daughter or her mama or something, because it's Oprah. Highly recommend you checking that out if you don't feel like reading the book. And please, please, please also look up the domestic slave trade and how Black women's bodies were used as breeding grounds. And once you get a little bit of that information, you'll be able to participate in more conversations from a position that doesn't put white womanhood at the center of the fight for reproductive justice, but actually includes other people within the narrative of the fight, because it's really disrespectful and really entitled for you to be upset because it's affecting you and not to have cared before when it was affecting people who didn't look like you.
Yeah, demanding the feminism of others is white feminism.
Say that again. That was
like,
good.
Oh, did you? Yeah, let me.
Yeah, no, I
demanding the feminism of others is the epitome, the tagline, the poster line, the book title of white feminism. You cannot. I understand outrage. I understand. And I also acknowledge that I am just a cisgendered Black man with a penis. But like, I understand wanting something to be different. I also understand having something happen, having a decision that's made that makes you feel like that you cannot, that you have lost control of your body, of your mind, of yourself, of your livelihood. I understand those things. I also understand that I am just one of many. I understand that I am one on a, like, get in line. I understand that what has happened to me is not isolated to being the only thing, that, like, I'm not the only person. I understand that there's education. I understand that there are people who want to support me, and there are people who need and want to be supported, and that all of that needs to exist simultaneously. And that is intersectional feminism. That is intersectional, like, existence. Do the work, show up, but also know that you're coming, and we've said this before, know that you're going into a space that is not your own, while you're trying to, with all of these people, with these organizations, figure out how to regain that control and how to bring individuality back into yourself so that we can all be free. So yeah, there's work to do, and there continues to be work to do. But do not demand that someone supports you. Do not demand that someone, like, shows up for you just because you now have feelings. That is like that. Like, fuck off. Like,
that is so disrespectful. It's so
really
disrespectful on so many levels. Because you got to remember, Black people are not just dealing with this now,
right?
Injustice towards reproductive rights. On top of that, we're still being slaughtered in the streets. COVID is still disproportionately affecting us.
And
this recession is going to disproportionately affect Black and brown communities that were already asked out because of COVID and what COVID did to the jobs and the stability available to Black and brown communities. So y'all just get into the party. Okay, because reproductive issues were already bad in Black and brown communities, especially impoverished Black and brown communities.
Yeah.
So when you're coming into this fight and all of a sudden you're putting on a Handmaid's
Tale?
First of all, this is not a costume party, yo. Like, it's not a costume party. Two, for the last, I don't know, 250 something years, you've been listening to white men. Okay, white men been running this shit. So maybe we could just try listening to black and brown women, black and brown people, because also part of reproductive justice is acknowledging that queer people exist and that queer people also need access. Because what are you going to do if a trans man needs access to abortion? Y'all ain't even talking about that yet. We ain't even talking about that. A non-binary person, what if they need reproductive rights? And you're sitting here thinking only of white women. Like, there's so many other people that this is going to affect, that it's not just going to affect one very loud subset. And in order for you to get the groups of people that have been organizers for generations, you have to be open and welcoming to information, to being told that, like, look, this country has prioritized your group for a very long period of time, and our communities need to prioritize ourselves. And if we get the rights, that means you are going to get the rights, because that's usually how this thing works. If it's going to benefit black and brown people, it's going to benefit all people within this country. So feel your feelings. Your feelings are absolutely valid.
Absolutely.
It is perfectly acceptable and even expected for you to be enraged, for you to be irate, for you to feel confused, for you to feel out of sorts, for there to be a sense of anxiety, a sense of doom, dread, all of that. Yes, feel all those feelings. And then find an organization that's led by black and brown folks, if possible, within your community. Figure out what they're doing and figure out how you can slot in. And sometimes that could be just you being a listening ear, okay? Yeah. You don't need to go run the organization. You don't need to go lead it. You don't need to go take over. They know what they're doing. And maybe this is a time for reflection for a lot of people within this country. I hope it can be reflection that leads to action, but also, you do you. Black women are going to black women. Black folk are going to black folk. We going to figure it out for us and our community. And this is not saying that, like, y'all are not welcome. And by y'all, I mean white people and people who happen to be white. It's not saying that y'all are not welcome. We just do things differently over here. Okay. Yeah. Now that this thing is solidified, a lot of the groups that were organizing in preparation for this are now starting to put their feet on the ground of, like, okay, this is how we're going to mobilize. So that's why I encourage you to look out and look for organizations that have been in this work for a while. And they're particularly led by black and brown folks whenever possible. But take a deep breath.
White women, mount up. Let's go. Free yourselves from, these white men's opinion.
Okay? If you guys could just, like, take a deep breath, calm down, find some black and brown organization, and then utilize that white womanhood, girl. Look, the Supreme Court would be completely different by next year.
Y'all have no idea.
By next year.
No idea. Or maybe you do, but just don't know how to. Like, I don't know. I cannot. Y'all confusing as shit.
I'm so confused. But it's okay. It's okay, because battle fatigue is going to be here for you as much as we can, but also remember, we are people too. So just as much as this is affecting you, it's affecting us.
Exactly. Thank you for listening to Battle Fatigue. Our show is produced by the folks over at Large Media. That's LARJ Media. Special thanks to the team at Good Juju for brand design and Roger Habone for theme song production. You can find other episodes of Battle Fatigue wherever you get your podcasts. Also, for updates and more, be sure to follow us on social media at Battle Fatigue PC. Thanks again for listening.